That's ridiculous. I don't spend every waking moment on the clock app. Emotional damage, emotional damage, emotional. Hello, I'm Myrna and welcome to the first ever video on my YouTube channel. I've decided to delve into booktube because I've been watching for over a decade. More recently, over the past couple of years, I've been into Booktok, so I thought why not combine my only love with my only love. You know how at the end of the year, all the booktubers come together and talk about every single book that they've read, give it a summary and why you should read it? So I thought I might do that, except it's the past couple of years and it's Booktok. Also, I'm months late. It's also a great introduction because it summarizes what I've been reading and what I'm about. So here we go. Hopefully it convinces you to pick up the books and read them as well. And if it doesn't, then darn. I'm very grateful for Booktok. As you can see, I was either reading classics or academic articles, so I didn't really have enough time to read for fun. But Booktok and Booktube paved the way. There's hopefully going to be different genres and something for everybody. So yeah, hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching. Buckle in. Buckle up? Buckle up. Buckle up in. First up, to the surprise of absolutely no one, it is the quintessential Booktok book, beloved by the entire internet. Everyone's favorite for a good reason, and there's nothing I can say to convince you to read it that hasn't been said already. It of course is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. A perfect adaptation of Homer's Iliad, focusing on Achilles from the point of view of Patroclus. If you haven't read it already, or you're just not a reader, I highly recommend the audiobook. It is beautifully narrated. A sound of it went viral on TikTok, so you probably already heard it. I'd be going about my day, and out of nowhere, I'd just get hit with the "He is half of my soul," as the poets say. Or, "We are made of memories." Oh, right here. Really gets you right here. It is perfect. Next up, we have a series that's been everywhere, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. I love that the series has transcended its targeted audience, and by that I mean, thanks to the series, a lot of people are reading new adult romance. It got me into reading new adult, so I'm very grateful for that. I personally think romance as a genre should be more widely read because it is such a huge part of the human experience. Something else that might convince you to read it is if you're nosy like I am. Memes, art, theories, there's just so much content surrounding the series, so if you want to know, I highly recommend it. What finally convinced me to read this is fan art of Cassian. I was like reading the first book, like, where does this guy show up? And he doesn't. All by Sarah J Maas. It's a new series that's more adult. It's Crescent City. Follows a slightly older protagonist. So if you're tired of reading about teenagers saving the world and finding their soulmate, this is perfect. The world is so intricate and really fun to explore. It has like one of the coolest fight scenes I have ever read. Sarah J Maas writes her male leads kind of differently from the stereotypical leads. I like the way she handles the romantic leads. This book really throws you in the deep end, like straight away. Just like the emotional deep end, the world building just all the deep ends. Crescent City, deep end city. What? Next up, we have the entirety of the Grishaverse. Now, I wanted to read Six of Crows because it came highly recommended. I am the type of person that needs to read everything in order, so I went back to read Shadow and Bone. And there's also a bunch of short stories, which I completely loved. The world building is epic. There's so many characters, so I guarantee everyone will find a favorite. And they each get their moment to shine. Darkling is such a compelling, interesting character, and Leigh Bardugo explores that really well. I found reading his origin short story really fascinating because there's so much history to a particular character. Of course, the Six of Crows series is perfect. I don't need to recommend it because everyone else already has. What I will recommend, however, is a fairy tale short story collection titled The Language of Thorns. It's the fairy tale stories of the people in the Grishaverse, what they had grown up reading. It's such a brilliant idea to explore that part of the world firsthand. There's so many interesting plot twists that stay with you, leave you really questioning why they were twists, why we sort of accept these narratives. I think Leigh Bardugo is so great at making us question why we find these certain ideals familiar. There is such amazing characters, the representation is great, and the plot is never boring for a single second. I will say though, book Mal was not my favorite, but show Mal redeemed the character for me. So if you want to watch the Netflix show, definitely read the series beforehand. There's also another series afterwards that follows the secondary characters of the first trilogy, and I just think that's so interesting. You're rarely even given glimpses of the world after the big finale, the big boss battle. So it's really nice to see these characters pick up the pieces, what they're doing now, years later, how they're handling things. Really get to grow with these characters and learn about them more. Next up, it's definitely one that you've seen everywhere. It is The Cruel Prince, or the Folk of the Air series by Holly Black. Hyped as a enemies to lovers romance on Booktok, but there's so much more to the series than that. It takes a back seat to the characters, especially Jude, our lead, who can be described as ambitious and ruthless, which is not something you see a lot in young adults. She and her sisters grew up amongst the Fae. They're more in line with how they were originally depicted, as somewhat malicious, sometimes sinister, tricksters. The world that she lives in has always been dangerous, so it's really nice to see her coming to her own and sort of take control. Next up, it's my absolute favorite thing to see this book series mentioned. It is an instant follow for whoever mentions it, and that is the Shadowhunter Chronicles. If you can't see the series behind me. I've been reading the books for over a decade. Each book gets better and better. It's really been magical to grow up with these characters and to see how they've been changed by things like war, love, and the bucket loads of angst. The representation, the quotes, the quality of the universe, world building, it is unmatched. Anyone who's read the Clockwork Angel series, all you need to do is mention Will Herondale's name, and from their reaction alone, that'll 100% convince you to read the series. It is a commitment, but it is worth it. I'd get anything Julian Blackthorne paints or says tattooed on me. Next up, another enemies to lovers. It is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. It's quickly become mine and Booktok's favorite. Complicated world building, compelling characters, and a plot where you never know what's going to happen next. You don't know who's lying, who's telling the truth. It's coming of age new adult. It really highlights that moment where you're coming to terms with, oh, this thing has been taught to us, but is that how it should be? Is that the truth? There's so much to this world as well, and also Hawke's, I'd get anything he says tattooed on me. No, you know what? I will not get anything he says tattooed on me. We're all very lucky that Jennifer L. Armentrout writes so fast. She's a queen. Next is another really long series, Shatter Me by Tahira Mafi. I've been wanting to read this series since high school, and I'm so glad Booktok finally made me. The final book just came out last year, so that would have been a long wait. I have zero patience and I love to binge read. All I gotta say is it feels nice to pick the right one in the life triangle, because I was Team Jacob in high school and that has permanently scarred me. Male lead speaks my language, literally, so I am on board. Book series is such a wild ride, and I love how she takes this world that's so compact and makes it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger so easily and brilliantly. As a reader, I was on board every step of the way. Next up, and finally one where I have the physical copy that I can hold up. Oh, look, I'm a real booktuber now, is Legend by Maria Lu. I have also been wanting to read this since high school, and I'm so glad I finally did, thanks to Booktok, because it is such an epic world. It is enemies to lovers, and it reminded me how much I love post-apocalyptic fiction, particularly YA. Shout out to the Hunger Games. I was really big on the Hunger Games as well, so this brought back a lot of memories, even though they're very different plots. But it's got unique world building, enemies to lovers. It's great, you can't go wrong. I definitely want to read more books by Maria Lu. Next up, we have the Lunar Chronicles. Initial thoughts was that I would have loved to read this growing up. It was one of my best friend's favorite book series growing up, so that finally convinced me to pick it up and read it. It's a really fun adventure that gets kind of dark at times. Basically sci-fi fairy tales, which what more could you want? Each one follows a different retelling of a princess. Next up, we have a YA duology that quickly became one of my favorites because it is a reimagining of 1001 Arabian Nights. I've got that right there. My favorite thing in the world is Middle Eastern classical literature. Wrath and the Dawn brings it to life in such a brilliant way. So 1001 Arabian Nights is basically stories within stories. There's a narrator, Shahrazad, and she's telling stories to her husband. It's where we get classic tales such as Aladdin, Sinbad, Ali Baba. It does the source material justice. The author does such a brilliant job including her own ideas as well. It's such a brilliant story. There's one quote from there that completely blew my mind. I feel like you can definitely tell that my favorite word is soul when I tell you this quote. And it goes, my soul sees its equal in you. I mean, come on. Come on. Next up is another brilliant reimagining. This time it's Romeo and Juliet. It's our boy Shakespeare. Also another duology. It's These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. It's Romeo and Juliet set in 1920s Shanghai, where our leads find themselves as rival gang members. There's so many brilliant things about the book, from the setting to the characters being so well thought out to the little references to the original. That definitely made me studying Shakespeare as much as I have 100% worth it. But what stood out to me the most was how brilliantly done the enemies to lovers trope was. The build up of angst and tension in particular. I'm only a quarter of the way through the second book. Let me tell you, I'm terrified to read more, but I'm so excited to read it. Next is Awakens by Elise Kova. This series was everywhere on Booktok, but people aren't talking about it as much, so I'm here to bring it back. It has every single thing that you would want in a fantasy book. What got me was the elemental magic system, because I feel like that's one of my favorites. It's a classic. The series does it so well in its own unique way. We follow an apprentice who discovers a rare power. There's this dark and brooding handsome prince who's then made to be her guide. Slow burn romance, pun intended, that's so brilliantly done. There's so much more to the world. There's also shorts that you can read if you want the backstories of different characters and things that they reference. And there's also a spin-off that happens with the next generation. So I'm definitely excited to read that. It's so brilliantly written. And yeah, elemental magic, baby. Next is An Enchantment of Ravens. Books about artists are my favorite thing ever, especially when the romance element is done this well. The author has written a couple of other fantasy YA standalones, which I'm grateful for because they're perfect as like a palate cleanser between longer sagas. You know what I mean? Sometimes you just want a one-book adventure, and it's great. Next up, Serpent and Dove, the enemies to lovers trope, which is everyone's favorite, including Booktok. Booktok is definitely not immune to the enemies to lovers trope. I've only read the first book in the trilogy thus far, and it does the trope well. It's between a witch and a witch hunter. There's a marriage of convenience. A whole bunch of other stuff happens. Another one where the protagonist is not as self-sacrificing as other YA protagonists are, which is also a nice fresh take to read about. The Shadows Between Us, another ruthless protagonist, which is very fun to read. Marketed as a Slytherin romance, which I definitely agree with. As a Gryffindor, if you couldn't already tell, it was a very interesting read as well. Booktok just loves a shadow boy. On this list, there's been 5 shadow boys. If you know, you know. Next is We Were Liars, or as Booktok and I personally like to call it, Sobbing at 5 a.m. Not sure why I started reading this book at midnight, but it was not the best choice on my part. It was so interesting that I had to stay up to finish the rest. The writing style is also very gripping and different. I pride myself on being able to guess the big plot twist before it happens. But with this book, I was completely blindsided. It was the biggest shock and it had such an emotional impact. Another addition to Sobbing at 5 a.m. is they both die at the end. The title and the idea is brilliant, it's devastating, it's heartbreaking. I love how the story was as compact as it was. I don't think it would have had the emotional hit as it would have had if the world expanded. The overall message of making the most out of every day is definitely one that cannot be overstated. Next up, we're getting to more adulty books now. We have The Invisible Life of Addie Larue, one of my newest favorites. It got me out of the biggest reading slump. It said, no, you know what, we're gonna read and we're gonna go on an adventure that spans hundreds of years. Writing style was beautiful. Loved all the characters in these very interesting circumstances. So yeah, definitely recommend this one. Another book that was an epic adventure and one of my new favorites is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. It's the definition of a magical adventure story about stories. The writing style is gorgeous and the story is extremely immersive. It reminded me of why I love stories so much, and that's all we can ask of a book, I think. Next we have some Taylor Jenkins Reid editions, The 7 Husbands of Evelyn, Hugo, and Malibu Rising. As a person who's had an unhealthy obsession with everything Hollywood for the majority of my life, the way these books bring you into the behind the scenes of what it's like to be a celebrity is so fascinating, so brilliantly done. Evelyn Hugo delves into the studio system really well, and it deals with the interpersonal relationships. of this like cultural icon. So fascinating and heartbreaking as a character study. Malibu Rising is similarly heartbreaking, an intense exploration of generational trauma. Read it while the Australian Open was on, so I was like keeping my eye out for Randall. Taylor Jenkins Reid is so good at writing these intense characters that have so much to explore, so much depth and life to them. They feel very human in a good way. Each character is going through these events that challenges who they are fundamentally. I'm definitely going to read more by the author. Next, The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Alternate universes is such a fun idea to explore. It's one of my favorites. The plot condensed down is a library where you can explore alternate timeline versions of yourself. If you had made different choices, if you had become something else, and someone telling you, hey, you're exactly where you need to be. So if you're on the lookout for that, this is the perfect book for you. Started this year reading Red, White and Royal Blue. Wonderfully done love story about a world that's a little kinder than our own. The president's son falling in love with a prince of England. It was a really wonderful, hopeful story. My definition of love is to be known. I just feel like this quote from the book captures it so well. Henry's room has never felt much like Henry, but in the quiet of morning, he shows up in pieces. Next, more enemies to lovers romance, The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. An office romance with really endearing characters. I found myself laughing out loud, and despite having made every decision in life where I can avoid having an office job, this made me want to have an office job. I think the hottest thing you can write about a male lead in a book ever is that he's like a clean freak. 100% my type. More romance with Beach Read by Emily Henry. I cannot emphasize enough how funny this book is. It made me cackle out loud. It's centered around two writers that knew each other in college, and because of differing circumstances they find themselves in neighboring beach houses. It does have its share of darker themes, but overall it was very funny. I could read about literary references all day. Ends with Us by Colleen Hoover, one of Booktalk's absolute favorite authors. You can definitely see why, because this is one of those books that you read and it just sticks with you. You're still thinking about it weeks and weeks later. It's a necessary read, yet emotionally very difficult. What really drew me in was that initial scene. The more I think about it, the more brilliant it is to me. It tells you so much that as a first time reader you don't pick up, but then later on you're like, oh, everything makes sense, everything's there for a reason. It's a definition of that one quote that's like, when a person shows you or tells you who they are, believe them. I'll definitely be reading more by Colleen Hoover and maybe making that into like a separate video. So that's the end, or at least all the books that I've read so far. I'll definitely be reading more thanks to Booktok. My next read is Girl, Woman, Other. What convinced me to read it was that it was one in those compilation videos. That's what I tell people my favorite book is, for them to think I'm intelligent. So I was like, alright, so I'm definitely reading that. This has been a very long video and it's going to be the first time I edit, so it's definitely a trial by fire. Thank you if you've watched it or just clicked through it. Hopefully in the future I'll have more content and more things to say. I was reading these books in particular, I didn't have content creation in mind. I didn't really make a lot of notes, but in the future I definitely will make more notes. So prepare for the analyses. Yeah, hopefully you can like and subscribe and we'll go on this journey together. See you on the flip page. Is that a good outro? Has someone done that before? See you on the flip page.